Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historic High Street Regeneration, Synergy or Oxymoron. I love the title that Graham came up with. I'm Beverly Gormley, the Heritage Trust Network's Programme Manager, and this event is part of our programme of High Street Regeneration events, where we focus on breathing new life into high streets, particularly through the reuse of older buildings. If you don't know the Heritage Trust Network, we're the umbrella organisation for non-profits that are rescuing, restoring and reusing historic buildings and places across the UK. We've currently got over 900 members in the 4 nations, and we run a large programme of training and networking events so that grassroots organisations, local authorities, consultants, funders and national bodies can all support each other. Please do use the chat to introduce yourselves and feel free to enable closed captions if you'd find them beneficial. It's also really helpful if you can change any strange screen names like iPad 1 or My Tablet to your actual name or to your organisation name, just so that I can check you in and say that you were here. Depending on what device you're using, you can right click on your video and rename yourself, or click on the 3 dots that appear on your video, or you can tap on the participants list and tap on your name if you're using a mobile device. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box for any questions that are posted during the event, as we have some time at the end to pick Graham's brains, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. And if anyone wants to save the chat at the end, you can tap on the 3 dots in the chat box and save it to your device. So that's quite enough from me. I'd like to welcome Graham Bell from Cultura Trust, who are long-standing members of the network and well-respected in the sector. In fact, I've heard Graham referred to as a regeneration guru a number of times. So I know this is going to be a really interesting afternoon. So over to you, Graham.
Thank you. Well, it's great to see you all, and I don't really obviously know what sort of background you have in approaching the subject today. So I'm going to focus specifically on Carlisle. Some of you may know Carlisle, but I'm taking the assumption that you don't. So there is a certain amount of scene setting about what kind of a city Carlisle is. And because most of you will have some experience in working in conservation in historic areas, this isn't a lecture or a seminar in the sense of trying to tell you how to do that. What I intend to do is try to get you to look at something that might be familiar, but from an unfamiliar angle. And hopefully at the end of it, you might then look at other historic cities, buildings, and just be mindful that there are other ways in which not only you, but other people look at those. So we will see if we can make a start. And as usual with these things, I'm just checking that you can all see. If you
I can see it, Graham.
Great. Okay. So the title is something that has probably always existed in terms of people who deal with economic development and social development, the two of which are the primary driving forces of what makes a town or a city what it is. Synergy, because ideally we'd always like everything to work together for good. Does it in practice? Well, let's have a bit of an exploration through this presentation. Oxymoron, in other words, is it actually impossible to have your cake and eat it? Is it impossible to be able to conserve, look after, enjoy, enhance historic high streets when you are, in a way, competing with the economic drivers of retail, business, other means in which that high street needs to generate an income. So let's start with, what is this? What are we looking at here? And shouldn't I be talking about buildings and places? What am I doing with a vase? And some of you may recognize what it is. Some of you may not. And the answer is that it's the Rubin vase from 1915, which was intended to illustrate illusion between a solid and two faces, the interface between people and the outline of the vase. And the reason I open with this is because the theme of this presentation really is that we often just don't see what is in front of us. We are conditioned, particularly if we've gone through school, college, university, into a profession, continued professional development as a planner, an architect, an economist, some other discipline. We've gone through that process, narrowing down our specialism until we can know something, a particular aspect of a town or city, conservation, planning, construction, really well. But in specializing, in narrowing our field of vision, sometimes we lose something of that broader context of how what we do is informing and influenced by the context within which we work. And if we're looking for synergy, then what we should be looking for is dialogue between what we see and what we can't see, between places and people, between things such as buildings and spaces, because ultimately a conservation area is about the sum of the parts. It's about the historic buildings, the structures, the physicality, but it's also about the spaces in between. And that I will be exploring as part of what we look at with Carlisle as a case study. But it's also about this perennial issue that we have between heritage and the local economy. Are they mutually exclusive, or somehow is it historic environments that contribute to, through their character, through their specialness, the local economy? In other words, can you define economically the added value that heritage can bring to a historic town and its economy and its community? Some of you, I'm sure, will know of John Betjeman. Some of you may recall his poem, which actually was written before the Second World War, not during or after. And here we have his poem about Slough, one of his most famous condemnations about what humans are capable of doing to places that are treasured, enjoyed, occupied by people. And particularly this phrase towards the end about messing up the mess they call a town. Is it possible for us in the more strategic end of the spectrum to plan towns in such a way that we can all feel comfortable, that they are home, that they are a place that we can identify with, or somehow is even starting at the master planning end of the spectrum, something where we're doomed? So let's have a look at some examples before we look at Carlisle as to what that might mean. And here we have a watercolour from 1945 showing Durham. And Durham has the castle and the cathedral on a peninsula wrapped by the river running around the outside. And therefore, the entrance into the peninsula is quite narrow, but quite significant, defensively, historically, but also economically and socially, because to get into it, you have to, in a sense, go through the bottleneck. And so in 1945, there was obviously a view that Durham was in some way too insular, too stuck in a rut with its history, too medieval, too congested, and that in order to thrive post-war economically, it needed improved access, which means infrastructure, which means roads. And so this illustration superimposes a vast new highway to provide capacity as well as access into the city. And what you can see where the red arrow is pointing is it arrives at a roundabout, and opposite the roundabout is a gateway, almost a Beaux-Arts building, showing arrival. This is the entrance to the historic city. So you are being welcomed by a building of some note. That was the principle. What was the reality? Well, this is the reality. That roundabout, that junction is there. And as you can see, just on this side of the highway, 4 lanes of traffic. But instead of it being a Beaux-Arts welcoming face of Durham, we're actually looking at the back, not the front. This is the back of a building which is a shopping centre and multi-storey car park. So instead of Durham welcoming you upon arrival, it's actually showing you its back. And is this something that we just can't get right, that we just can't handle? This sense of the relationship between economic assets that can create value and that sense of place. Is this something that was a one-off, that Durham got it wrong? Some people may not even consider that they got it wrong, because this development creates new streets that connect with the historic streets. What about Newcastle, for example? Bigger city, regional hub, same era, looking probably more 1950s, just into the 60s, and a vast new plan, a completely new plan for a city. Was this conceptual? Was this intended to be implemented? The buildings in red are the only buildings that existed pre-war, pre-concept, that would be retained. Everything else would be completely cleared away. And as you can see, it's based on the creation of infrastructure, the ring road that goes around the outside, that then feeds into a series of planned blocks, rectangular blocks, orthogonal blocks with courtyards or spaces in between. But the principle was that this was a new plan for a new city in a new era. And the only reason you would keep anything from the past was simply as a landmark, a point of reference to try and remember, oh yeah, this is Newcastle, isn't it? This was the vision that the plan had in mind. How to create something that was, wow, exciting. Hey, this is going to be really good. We're going to start from scratch. We're going to make it happen. Everything is up for grabs. And let's make it the new world that is deserving after a world war. What did we get? Well, not quite the vision in the sketches. This footbridge is across Northumberland Street, which at the time was the A1, so the main road from York through Teesside, Tyneside, and on its way up to Scotland. And it was just amazing that this was considered, well, yeah, so what's the problem? We want the traffic, and we want people, they can't mix. So we force everyone to go over the footbridge. And that way we can continue to have through traffic. And in the meantime, the people who are capable of walking up 2 flights of steps will continue to do so. It is possible for master planning to get it right in the sense of a strategic plan for creating or recreating a historic city completely, and in a sense from scratch, and in a sense not only that achieves the objectives of impressing in the architectural and planning sense, but achieving the objectives economically. And this was the plan in the early 1800s to superimpose a new city centre on the medieval centre of Newcastle. And what's interesting about this, as we look at it now, is that it might seem almost purist in its layout, but when you start to think about how it operates, it makes a lot of sense. And even though we may not do a scheme like this today, the principles that underlie it are still very much relevant, because if you look at the main facades onto the streets, that's where the money is spent, the neoclassical ashlar. That's where you want to draw the customers in, the business. But at the back, that no one sees, these were cheap bricks made on site. So the idea was just simply to get the walls up as cheaply and as quickly as possible, because it just didn't matter what the quality was. You'll also see that the plan was that apart from one square to the right, the whole of the new city lacked any form of public space, because the principle was that if you created long, narrow, generally narrow streets, apart from the long one running left to right at the bottom, is that you maximized floor space, you maximized economic capacity. And by simply putting all of the emphasis, almost like a stage set, on the facade, you could maximize the ability of the new city to generate an economy. And that lay behind really the shop window, literally, that was along the streets. So the whole thing, if you were looking at it purely from an economic perspective, was incredibly compelling. In terms of how that converted in reality, then the larger, wider main street, considered to be one of, if not the best street in England, Grey Street, because of the curve and the way in which you look at the neoclassical architecture, is that this was at the top of the hierarchy. It allowed you to bring together in one street all of the high-end functions, the function rooms, the civic function rooms for events, the hotels, the banks and the restaurants. But you then drop down the hierarchy to a street that also has that swept curve, but a lot of the enhancements, the embellishments of the neoclassical architecture are gone. This is simply about proportion and about the way in which perspective is used to provide enclosure. But the reality is that this is bulk architecture to create bulk economic space. So the ground floor is a continuous ribbon of retail and other services, whether it's cobblers or other service providers. But one of the reasons that it worked was that the first floor might be the administrative office for the retailer, or it might be additional displays, for example, hosiers and so on, where there might be changing rooms. But the top 2 floors would be where the owner or the retailer would live. And so what you had was not only maximum use of ground in terms of the economy. But you also had this diversity, so that the city was in use 24/7. It was residential, it was commercial, it had everything you needed. So this was not only good business, this was actually a good society where you could go out of your front door and go to buy something or go for a meal or whatever else. It was everything integrated. The problem then came by the beginning of the 20th century, because it was no longer considered appropriate, favourable to live in the city centre above the shop. If you were anyone that was anyone, then you must have a house in the suburbs. And so gradually the trend left the upper floors abandoned and the ground floor working just 9 to 5. And over the years, what began to happen was that the ground floor would be a commercial lease. It might include the upper floors. Sometimes the upper floors would actually be completely sealed off, and the retailer would make that a condition that they were only paying for the floor space they were using. If they were using the first floor, for example, for storage, because previously goods would be brought in as and when needed, but the more that retailers needed to have a supply to hand, then the first floor would perhaps become more storage. But no one looked after the upper floors, because why would they? And that meant that the top floor would often flood. And it was only when the flooding trickled down to the next floor, where there were leaks into the staff canteen or goods being damaged through dampness, that someone might venture up to the roof and try and plug a hole. And this was the nature of the loss of the residential population in this fragmentation between economic use and residential. What was the consequence? Well, really, by the 1990s, there was over 1 million square feet in the city centre that was vacant, either completely unusable, I mean, really derelict, but not a full building. What I was describing was dereliction from above, or underused, because most of the value of the property was in the ground floor, the street scene. And that led to a 6-year programme, echoing the 6 years in the 19th century when Grangertown was built, a 6-year programme of investment that brought people back into living in the city centre. So instead of this city of segregation, of retail 9 to 5 and the pubs in the evening, it started to be occupied as in a more stable way. Now, you might think that York would be above all of this, immune to such influences, because York is just, I mean, it's York. You know, York is, it's loved, it's admired, it's higher value economically as well as in terms of residents. But we did a survey just before the pandemic of the centre of York. And what you can see in this diagram is that there was a considerable amount of upper floor disuse. There were, in the dark blue, some disused properties, and only 1 or 2, and really at the margins, that were derelict. Why is this? I mean, York has such a buoyant economy, and how is it that it got to this extent of underuse? And the problem comes back again to the way in which high street properties are valued and the way in which city centres are used. And the more that people moved out, and the way in which particularly parts of York, which are pedestrianised and serviced at sort of certain times, what was happening was that it was mission creep, if you like, where gradually the retailers, and it is largely retail, but there are some other businesses that are operating in the city centre, is that the focus again was driving towards ground floor, and that the upper floors may be used, but the one thing that really was not existing was dividing the ground floor from upper floors in terms of use. For example, as you'd seen earlier in Newcastle in the 19th century, retail at ground floor and residential above. We tried to quantify that and take exceptional margins of error. So if we looked at the total of the green, blue and red areas on the previous plan, what you can see is that there was probably about 1.5 million square feet that was had capacity to be better used. And if we convert that into either economic or residential, then we're saying that if the whole of York city centre was being fully exploited, fully used, utilised, then it could create employment for over 15,000 in office use, or because residential takes more space, about 12,000. If we then apply a 50% error, in other words, by doing the survey, we couldn't see everything, we weren't reliable in terms of what we could see. So if we halved that, what we're saying is that at the bottom of this page, if the centre of York was brought back into full use, we could be creating employment for 4,000 people and able to provide residential accommodation for 3,000. So we've got retail, business and residents all maximising the use of the city, which is good economically, but it's also good as a dynamic in terms of the city being able to operate holistically. So let's have a look at Carlisle, having had a look at that sort of context. So Carlisle, that's where it is. The only other comparator in what's on the map might be Berwick, which the rumour keeps going round that because a treaty wasn't cancelled, Berwick is still at war with Russia. Whether it's true or not, no one can either prove or disprove because the document isn't, it's gone missing. So Carlisle is very much near the edge of the green, near the line with Scotland. And that's going to run through a certain amount of what I have to say about what distinguishes a place. So if I was to write a page describing Carlisle, but I didn't put the name Carlisle at the top, how would you know by a description that this was Carlisle? And this is something that we apply whenever we're doing conservation area work or historic areas, national parks or whatever else, is the real test of distinctiveness is that it couldn't be said about anywhere else. And you don't need the name at the top because you immediately recognize the characteristics which define that place. So think Carlisle border. So it's got the typical characteristics of a medieval walled town, which is top left at A, the castle, in the middle, D, the church, and slightly to the right, F, market. These three ingredients are present in pretty much every town and city in the UK and indeed on the continent. And usually they're in line. The sequence might vary, but those three are always present and they're usually forming the backbone of the settlement, whether it's been walled in or not. So here we have the orientation with the castle to the north and the river to the north of the castle. So what happens, thinking back to what happened in Durham and in Newcastle? Well, along comes the principle that, yeah, but we want to get from east to west and we can't get around the edge. So let's put in a road. So instead of having that historical integrity of castle, church, market, and a town clustered around it within the walls, and you read the integrity historically and economically of the whole sum of the parts. We've now got this 4-lane, it's not a motorway, but it is actually a 30, but I'm not sure how many people stick to that. This major route running through. And lo and behold, the Millennium Project for Carlisle included the intervention of the footbridge to allow you to get from the museum, which is to the right, and the city, which is on the right, over the top of the road. And you'll notice that there are barriers. So the whole point is that whatever you do, don't cross. So you must go up, across and down, and then you can get to the castle. We do still have in Carlisle the church, the cathedral, and a cluster of buildings which have survived. And here we have a fairly recent intervention to create a larger and more accessible cafe within the precinct of the cathedral. And you can see that it's all in the distinctive red sandstone, which is characteristic of the borders. So colour and material are characteristic, but that's not really what today's talk is about. Then we have the marketplace and we have the town hall. So those ingredients continue to operate as part of this working city. I said that the proximity of Carlisle to the border was important. And this is one building with two images along the frieze above the shop front. And on the left, you can see an inscription that says, in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie had his quarters on this site. And on the right-hand side, the year later, you can see that the Duke of Cumberland had his quarters on site. Now, of course, neither of them were stopping off at M&S to get stocked up on underwear and other essentials. But it's the principle that Carlisle was this conduit between England and Scotland on more than one occasion. So border history, in every sense, is absolutely embodied in what Carlisle is. The other thing which is less well known about Carlisle is that it was a confluence of 7 different railway companies. And you can see them there. This borders in the Citadel station, and that the railways converged because it was the West Coast main north-south route, but also a connection across to Newcastle and out to the coast, such as to Maryport. And you can see just to the right where it says Petrol Goods. This is the end, the terminus of the Settle Carlisle Railway. And one of the first projects I did with Cultura was looking at a What Goes Where grant programme, because the Settle Carlisle Railway is a 76-mile long conservation area, sometimes only the width of the track, but it was characterised by the Midland Railway, which adapted its corporate style according to the materials and the characteristics through which it was passing. But then once you get into the city itself, you've got all of these different railway companies converging. And it's not just the railway lines which exist, it's all of the servicing and support that goes with it. So a key characteristic of the development of Carlisle during the 19th century was people. And it was estimated that at one stage, just under half the population of Carlisle were directly employed by the railways. All of that still exists in terms of infrastructure, but what people are less aware of is if you look carefully within the city centre, there are the clues, the remnants of a city whose existence and economic thriving depended upon those railways. So here you can just make out on the stone sign, Caledonian Railway Company, Goods Manager's Office. And that's about understanding the relationship between conservation and the economy. And it's about being able to tell the story about how the city developed, but also about how that story is relevant to the economy and community of the city today. The other story, which is pretty unique, can it be pretty unique? I mean, either it is or it isn't. So let's say it's unique to Carlisle, is that across the Solway in Scotland, near Gretna, was a munitions factory, which was being built just before the First World War. And the significance for Carlisle of this was that if you are employing something like 30,000 people, first of all in the construction and then in the operation of a munitions factory on a rural site, you get sort of parched. You want a drink, but the nearest place to really get a drink is Carlisle. And so the demand for alcohol in Carlisle became such an issue that a scheme was launched called the Carlisle Experiment, or the State Management Scheme, where the government took over the ownership and management of the pubs in Carlisle to be able to manage the consumption of alcohol and avoid it getting out of hand. And one of the stories was that because the pubs would close, obviously at a particular time in Carlisle, a train would leave Gretna and they would collect all of the cash from the people on the train, so that when the train arrived into Carlisle 10 minutes before closing time, there would be between 100 and 200 whiskies already on the counter, ready and waiting for people who dashed from the station into the pub before it closed. So this was something which ultimately became a national precedent for state ownership and regulation of alcohol. But for Carlisle, it's one of its distinctive stories. And that story is told not only in books, but in the survival of the buildings that were the pubs. And on the right, you can see the very first one, the Gretna Tavern, which is now a bank. But the story was that in converting it not only to government-regulated alcohol consumption, that people had to eat with their drink to make sure that their alcohol consumption was proportionate. And as you can see on the slide, the architect for all of these pubs refused to supply spittoons. So what does Carlisle do? Where's its catchment? Where's its economy? Who are its people? And how in some way does this share the story that might be relevant to your interests? Well, Carlisle, as you can see, is a borderlands city. Some people aren't aware that in terms of geographical area, Carlisle is the biggest city in England. Its population is about 74,000, something like that, in terms of the city itself, and a bit over 100,000 within the area shown purple. But the question is, well, who are its audiences? Who are its markets? Is it purely serving a local population, or is it serving more widely? And because of the way the geography works with Cumbria and the Northeast being dominated by Newcastle and Gateshead, Newcastle in terms of the city centre and Gateshead by the metro centre, for those two for retail, is that surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of the market for employment and for business is not just the north of Cumbria, but into the borderlands, the border area of Scotland. So it's not unusual for people within the arc that I've shown to get the train or drive down to Carlisle to do some shopping. And in fact, even the travel to work times for Carlisle Some of them can be up to an hour and a half distant. And the reason that Cumbria is not, that, you know, Carlisle is not, in a sense, the county town of Cumbria. And that's partly historic. And the reason for showing the tint the way it is that the further down you go, Penrith is a market town in its own right, and then Kendal really is more of a county town in terms of serving what is now the south of Cumbria. So the catchment area isn't necessarily what you would think it to be. So here we have Carlisle from the air, the river, the castle you can see, and that quite familiar historical pattern of the almost like the fishbone running up the spine of the city, and then the radiating plots, burgage plots to each side, and right in the middle, the church. And you can see quite clearly the route heading over towards the bridge. Now, you might think, well, this all looks nice and comfortable, but in 2015, the area shown blue was the extent of the floods. And it's a very wide floodplain. But what you can see in the center of the screen is that, in a sense, the castle, the city comprising the castle, church, and market is almost on a peninsula of slightly higher ground. So the castle was not only strategically well placed, but actually the city centre itself was preserved, exempt from the worst ravages of the floods. And if you look at this photograph, you can see the castle. This is looking west. You can see the castle. You can see that major road that featured in an earlier slide, and the cathedral to the left. What is interesting about this picture is that everything is at a relatively modest height, round about 4 to 5 stories. So this is not a city that has been subject to a considerable number of high new infill office buildings or whatever else. The irony is that this is not an aerial photograph from a drone. This photograph is taken from the Civic Centre, which is one of the few, if not the tallest, 1960s, I think it is, building in the conservation area. This is very characteristic of Carlisle, what's sometimes described as diaper brickwork. And this is city centre. You know, this is not suburbs. This is part of the diversity, the variety that exists within Carlisle. So does this, the major hotel looking over the marketplace. These two are both, in a sense, the extremes of the spectrum of what the conservation area represents. But I want to come back to the theme that I was flagging up in Newcastle. Here we have a street, and this says an awful lot about Carlisle. First of all, you can see that there is no consistency, no uniformity whatsoever in terms of the height of the building or what's going on above shop level. And that leads us back to the question that we were looking at elsewhere about investment. It was certainly said in Newcastle that the reason people didn't spend money on the upper floors was that 90% of the value of the property was on the ground floor, and that in itself was dictated by maximizing frontage. So if you had a door providing separate access to the upper floors, quite often that would be removed, the shop front widened, and access to the upper floors would be moved inside only from the unit itself, which then caused problems subsequently for reintroducing residential. So Carlisle won't be 90-10, but the question mark is, what is the rate of value between those two? And is that going to affect not only post-pandemic, but energy crisis and everything else? Is that going to adversely affect the future of the high street above the high street? Because ultimately, people going into the city only think of the ground floor. They just don't look up. They don't see, unless they're on holiday, they don't look at what is above the functionality of a high street. The other aspect of these properties is to look behind the high street. And what you can see here is very characteristic not only of Carlisle, but many historic cities, that you have that curtilage line of the main street, but then it gradually sort of crumbles down, disintegrates into blocks of varying shapes, heights, sizes, orientation, some of which would be storage, some of it would be retail. It could be all sorts of things going on there. So apart from thinking 90-10 vertically, is there a 90-10 looking back inside the plot? And therefore, does anyone look after all of these blocks that lie behind the main street? The answer is Carlisle isn't homogeneous. It's a really fascinating city in that there is no predominant architectural style. There is no predominant form of development. Yes, there are the lanes and the offshoots at the back, but here's an example which was used in the advertising for this talk, of Treasury Court, where it's actually thriving because it's got that intimacy that exists in the heart of a city. It's got cafes, it's got retail, it's got residential above. In a sense, in this one photograph, you see the city. But one of the other characteristics when we did a public survey about what people considered Carlisle to be and what was important, surprisingly, was green space. And this is Tully House, the museum, which with a wonderful garden in the foreground. And there are other houses with courtyards that are absolutely beautiful and form part of that complexion that makes up the city centre. If we look at designations, then, surprisingly, I think, is not the number of listed buildings. York, for example, has far more per square kilometre. But here we have a city with a considerable proportion that is scheduled monument and therefore open space. And that makes sense of the public's comment that what they like is that, unlike, for example, Newcastle that I showed you earlier, is that Carlisle has a lot of breathing space. So you can shop, you could buy your packed lunch, your meal deal, but you can walk across the street and there's lots of space where you can enjoy open air. Being a large conservation area and producing a conservation area character appraisal, inevitably we break that down into character zones. And what's interesting for Carlisle is that those character zones are not just about the architecture, they are about neighbourhoods. There aren't hard lines between the different areas, but you are conscious that you're moving from one particular neighbourhood into another. If I compare the way we approach all of that economically as well as in conservation terms, this is Whitehaven. And a number of you may or may not have been involved with conservation area grant programs where grants are provided to lift, to relift use, value, benefit, public benefit in properties, usually in smaller clusters than a whole city centre. Here it's around the marketplace in Whitehaven, and it's looking at priority buildings, ones which really need considerable investment support through the grants, possibly at 80%, something like that, and others which are desirable. And it struck me that we've done this kind of work for decades, but it struck me that one of the distinctivenesses for Carlisle is that if it is a city of neighbourhoods, then this is not about the grand plan that you saw at the beginning of the presentation, where we'd look at a uniform approach right across the whole city. It's about breaking it down into neighbourhoods and then breaking it down yet again into individual properties and different functions, so that each neighbourhood is a sum of the parts, because Carlisle is not uniform, and therefore we can't apply a consistent or homogeneous approach to conservation. If we then look at the distribution of functions within Carlisle, in some ways it's dangerous to zone, because things never quite fit as neatly into that. But one of the fascinating things about how cities have evolved is that if you look at the purple block, which is shown to the right in grey, that in the 1980s, this was redeveloped as the Lanes, which was a form of urban shopping centre. But what you can tell by looking at the grey part is that the grain within the shopping centre allowed for a mixture of unit sizes, and indeed was almost mimicking historic street plans and hierarchy, and that it also had the frontage, which is shown in the photograph, of buildings onto the marketplace. Now, the more informed would immediately identify that those are not historic, but in terms of the general street scene, they fit in reasonably well. And given the hiatus that we've been experiencing, I suppose triggered particularly by the pandemic, towards online retail and the real acute difficulties that high streets are having, actually the Lanes is 80% occupied, which is pretty good going, and probably reflects the percentage of occupancy across the city centre. So to have about only 20% of floor space not in use, which could be just because it's on the market at the moment and will come back into use, or because there are problems, that's not bad for a historic city. That's attracted the initiative of a range of players through the Carlisle Town deal. And they've identified a number of projects that require intervention and therefore financial support. Top centre, you can see the market hall, which, again, like markets across the country, they can ebb and flow. And this one is surviving, but it's not really thriving. It's not the centre that it used to be. And then if you look further down, the deep purple area, that's what we're going to look at in a moment. But one of the problems many of us have experienced is that the move away from online retail has left larger department stores in particular bereft. So this is one, Hooper's, which is a single block. If you look at street level, there are entrances to the block. To the right-hand side, you can see an entrance with smaller windows above leading to the upper floors. This is a real challenge for Carlisle. It's a very attractive building, but it's something that, how do you redeploy a building that is, in a sense, a unity, a single entity, into other functions? Could this work with residential or office space above? The general trend for Carlisle is not attracting new office users. Office users are tending to go to the outskirts with ample car parking. The other one, which lots of towns and cities across the country have suffered from, is the loss of either House of Fraser and other larger department stores. And this one is currently work in progress. Costa have taken created one of the units on the ground floor. But what's going to happen to a building of this bulk? Not only height, but behind this building are all of the warehouses where the service vehicles came into the city centre, provided the supplies to the warehouse, which then fed the department store at the front. It's an enormous block in a city that is, as I described, characterised by neighbourhoods and much smaller scale, more intimate development. Behind that, and you can see the M&S sign at the bottom, is that we have an area of a very intimate city centre that is dominated by sheds, block buildings that, these can't be adapted. So the question then is, at what point and how do they become reintegrated within the fine grain of what is still largely a medieval city centre? And last of the big headaches is Debenhams. And the caption below this isn't mine. This is what someone wrote when they posted this photograph. This again, like the Durham example, but in a sense inverted. This has multi-storey car parking with Debenhams, the department store, over several levels. And what do you do with a building like this that has become disused? How do you convert it to something else? Or, like some, is it just destined to be demolished? So coming back to the town deal and looking at where are the big problems, where are the big challenges for Carlisle? And I've ringed two areas, one of which is being driven by the university and the other around the station. And within the station one, we'll come back in a moment to the Turkish baths. So here we have the station, a grand entrance, if ever there was one, to the city at the southern end, but a short walk through into the main streets, a hotel on the left, and you can see all of the glazed canopies that are above the tracks at the skyline. The problem, as is often the case with historic railways, is that it's single-sided. It has a front, but it also has a back. And this is the west. And so the challenge here is, how do you somehow stop the enforced isolation to the part of the city that lies beyond this enormous wall? One of the suggestions, and this is work in progress, it's conceptual, it's not a design scheme, but it's just looking at the principle of capacity, of how to open the railway station from the west and to create a range of mixed-use development, possibly hotel, move some of the car parking out of the city centre. What other functions can be added to the city that don't displace the economic functions within the city centre itself? Cultura is a building preservation trust, and a number of years ago we were asked whether we would take this building on, which was the Plaza Hotel. On the left, it doesn't look much. It's quite narrow, tall, but what you don't appreciate is that there are, or were, at least 2 stories going below the entrance. And you can see on the right-hand picture, after it was demolished, just how deep a plan it took up. This is now a gaping hole in that area next to the Citadel station and the university scheme. And you can see on the right one of the problems, which is the back of the bulk warehousing. But you'll see to the left another building that I'll come back to in a moment. The other one whose fortunes are much more on the up is this building, which from the outside doesn't look particularly characterized as anything. Small windows. What's this all about? Well, the answer is that it's a Turkish bath. So you don't want lots of large windows. You want to actually be keeping the heat in and enjoying what's going on inside. And a group of friends have been set up to look to take over the future of these baths, which are owned by the council. And then the other major scheme, historic entrance into the town and now city. This is now part of the scheme to bring the university right into the city centre. Now, a university, if it's a campus, isn't just about teaching space and associated resources. It's potentially drawing in thousands of students. Now, Carlisle is not a campus university city. Many of the students for Carlisle travel in and leave again on a daily basis. So this could change the dynamic of not only the site itself, but the extent to which, whether it's 20%, whether it's more or less of underused floor space within the city centre, would we see a change in the demographics of the city? And Carlisle has seen a slight increase in its population, according to the census in the last 10 years. So it's up 2.3%, which is below the national average, but it is up. What that masks is that the population age is up 20% for the over 65s, but it's down 2.5% for the under 65s. So we are actually seeing a challenge to the profile of population of Carlisle and how the city can handle that. And for comparison, Allerdale, which is just to the just to the west and running down the top part of the coast of Cumbria, it saw a slight fall in its population, but Copeland, further down, which is Whitehaven that I showed you earlier, its population was down 5%. So Carlisle's got issues of demographics that we need to look at. I mentioned this warehouse building from the Plaza site. And of course, this is an example of how the opportunity to bring back into productive use a bulk building, but of some character, historic character, is attracting development interest. So we will see, not only directly through the investment in these major schemes, but the cascading effect on values and bringing buildings back into use happening. I mentioned about the demographics, and one of the curious things also about Carlisle is that property values are still quite depressed. So you can see top centre, a pocket of light yellow, surrounded by higher value residential properties, and then the coast at lower value again. And the area that's coloured a deeper orangey red is Lake District National Park. So people want to live in the most desirable place and pay for it. But what you can see is that Carlisle has some challenges in terms of values. So one of the questions that had been put to me was, if we were to try and bring more residential back into the city centre, could people afford it? And what would that do in terms of car parking and other facilities? And that comes back to what I described about forgetting trying to come up with a single solution, a one size fits all for a city centre, but breaking it down into neighbourhoods and recognising that neighbourhoods need corner shops, they might need laundrettes, they might need other facilities that you would expect to find in the suburbs. This plan shows what can't be seen in anything that I've shown you so far, and that is to do with the indices of multiple deprivation. And if you look at the scale on the right, what you can see is that the blue, and the darker the blue, the better. Those are people who are more comfortable, they have higher income and general health and well-being. Whereas the red, and the deeper the red, the worse it gets, are people who are suffering from multiple forms of deprivation. So low income, poor health, lack of access, sort of digital literacy, lack of access to the internet, and other things like that. So where the C of Carlisle is, that's where the station is. So what you can see is that the conservation area is in the marginally lower and therefore worse suffering of the deprivation. So what we've got to do is look at how any plans for the city centre can benefit everyone. The other thing that we've looked at is the role of the city centre in people's perceptions. And by that, I mean in the broadest, most inclusive way, because we tend in planning to think about economic outputs and broader population sense of well-being, you know, comfortable that the facilities are there. But this plan was prepared by a group for the Alzheimer's Society, people going into the city centre and feeling, was it their city centre? Did they feel comfortable? Did they feel that they could move around safely and freely? And the point really is that if you look at the scoring, one of the issues that has come up time and time again about Carlisle city centre is that the public transport is not what it could be. It's there, but for example, in terms of attracting young people to have an evening out, that public transport stops earlier than it could do, and therefore prevents some people from coming into the city. Carlisle has a venue building, but it doesn't have a theatre of the size that would take touring productions. It has a small theatre, which again is consistent with the neighbourhood characteristic, but public transport is something of a restriction, as indeed are facilities and amenities that I've described, the sort of neighbourhood things. So coming to a close, what is all of this saying about how we would look at a historic city? And what we're saying here is that if you want something to be genuinely resilient and sustainable, it has to take into account not only the cultural aspects of its architecture and history, the social aspects of residential communities and people coming in to use facilities, the economic aspects of business and retail, and the environmental aspects, the green open spaces that the public said they identify with, and the other aspects that we're increasingly talking about in terms of energy consumption and the carbon agenda. And you probably think, well, yeah, of course, you know, I recognize all of that. Really? Well, when we did a survey, and this is a European survey, we found that only 6% of organizations were truly working across disciplines, were clearly working inclusively, transversely. So there was a lot to do to try and get people to think and work much more across boundaries. And so to close, this diagram illustrates that we have some real problems about how people can see beyond their usual professional perspective. Some people will argue absolutely that a place is all about the economy, and they can't see it any other way, because without a thriving economy, you have no place. And other people, particularly for historic conservation areas, will argue that character is everything. If you don't have character, you've got no sense of place, pride, ownership, belonging. So why bother? Why look after things? Why live there? Why go shopping there? And so one of the messages of this presentation is recognize that there are multiple perspectives of the same subject. And the more you can see every perspective, the more successful you can be. And I want to close with a slide that isn't from Carlisle, but is actually from Bucharest. This, believe it or not, was the building used by the secret police during the socialist, the communist era. You normally think of secret police occupying clandestine locations. This is anything but clandestine. But would you believe now it's now the main office for the Romanian Society of Architects? So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Graham. That has been absolutely fascinating. And next time I'm on my way up to Scotland, I will definitely be stopping in at Carlisle. I've been to the castle and I often stop at the petrol station at the big supermarket by the motorway, but I've never actually walked around the city centre. And now you've convinced me. I will be there. Now, I've got quite a few questions myself, but I just wanted to open it up to everyone. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there will be lots of them. So who would like to go first? I haven't picked any up in the chat, so if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions directly, please do. Or maybe you've covered it all. Is that someone unmuted? Is it Susan?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm a Geordie, born in Newcastle, so I know Newcastle very, very well. I also worked in Durham for a long time, so I know that very well. And I was a postgraduate student there. So all of that was very interesting. And the friend that I'm standing in for, who lives just south of Carlisle, grew up in Botcherby, and after traveling the world came back to Carlisle and lives there now and gets very heated about what's happened to it and what might be planned for it and so on. So anyway, she knows it much better, the place much better than I do, and I said I would take part in this on her behalf. But my question is mine, nothing to do with her. Just wondered, I mean, it's, you know, I thought about hoopers, formerly bullocks or bullows as the local people called it. Remember that very well from visiting her, and still not necessarily a solution to that, or to some of the places like, as you mentioned, Debenhams and House of Fraser, possibly solutions. But it's true of everywhere, in every city centre, as you said. What to do with these former department stores and so on. I don't think that anyone has found a solution really yet. My question is, did you do any surveys about the level of how many people come into Carlisle to shop now as opposed to pre-pandemic? Because that surely in every city across the whole of Britain must have changed dramatically. I mean, people did much more online, had to do much more online shopping. And I think they've carried on doing it, even though it is very nice to go into cities. I mean, I live in central Scotland now, and I used to go to Glasgow and Edinburgh quite a lot. Hardly ever do that now, just never seem to get round to it. So I just wondered, did you do any surveys? Do you have any figures about the numbers who come into Carlisle to shop as opposed to a few years ago?
I can't give you specific figures, but what I would say is that the way the consultations went, and thinking of the plan that I showed with the arc into Scotland and the strip along the Solway, is that people don't think of Carlisle as being a shopping centre. They will go there for some things, but even from the coast, Maryport, Workington, if you want a serious shop, you go to Newcastle or Gateshead. You would just, for the sake of 2 hours maximum drive, if you're really wanting comparative shopping, that's where you go. Interestingly, some of the shops do attract trade from central Scotland, which is why I was showing that arc. And that's not just in terms of sort of specialists such as bookshops, but even things like at Gretna off the M6, there is now the the retail village or whatever it's called. So I think the answer to your question is that no, it hasn't bounced back to what it was pre-pandemic. And Carlisle is niche. You know, people go there partly to socialize while shopping. It's not that the retail offer is particularly distinctive. But I come back to my point about neighborhoods, because it's the independent retailers who are holding Carlisle together. It's those who have something that you can't really buy anywhere else, that is keeping that economy going. And in response to your point about department stores, in York, one of the, I think that it might have been the Debenhams, but there was one which is between Lenall and the river. And in discussions that we had with the developer, it would be possible to puncture that block with a link connecting the river to the street and open it up in a sense, as I described with the fishbone, where you've got the main link, but you can then subdivide the department store into smaller units, either a ground floor retail or upper floor residential. But the feeling when we were doing the survey in York was that even York was struggling in terms of trying to match value with market. And the feeling was that what we might see increasingly, because people will continue to shop online, is that instead of having residential above a shop, the residential might even come down to the ground. And the ground floor might have the entrance lobby for the bikes and the prams and a gym or some other communal facility, and the residential above. So I think it's, you know, the jury is out about all of those things.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graham. Oh, Weymouth Area Development Trust has their hand up.
Sorry, I should have put my name as well. My name's Sue Prescott, and I'm the chair of the Weymouth Area Development Trust. And my question is about ownership, property ownership. One of the areas we've found a great difficulty in Weymouth is, first of all, finding out who the owner of the buildings are. And then when we have, which have at times been multiple insurance companies, is how do we then start talking to them about what they're doing with it? Because we have several properties where they're just sitting on it. They've just left it. Did you find that in Carlisle?
Absolutely. One of the slides I showed where we were asked if we could take on a building was the Plaza Hotel. And the problem there was that it had been through a succession of developers who obviously thought they were on a winner until they got a hold of it, and then found that actually it was an incredible liability. And we tried, with the assistance of the council, to trace the owner, because the developer, the last developer who was visible, disappeared. And because it was a private company, they'd been wound up, but we couldn't then trace what had happened to them. And the rumour was that it had defaulted to the Duchy of Lancaster. And we thought, well, is this good news because we know who it is, or is it bad news because trying to get any dialogue going will be impossible? And in the end, because people were getting into the building under public safety legislation, the council had to demolish the building. So they demolished the problem as well as the building. I think there are ways usually of finding out who owns, but what you're describing is that if someone is refusing to communicate, cooperate, it depends on how much a local authority is prepared to use enforcement action, either for repair or compulsory purchase. And I would say the appetite for something like that now, compared to 20 years ago, is virtually nil.
Thank you. You've just reflected our experiences completely. So ours is more likely to be the Duchy of Cornwall, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Different branch of the family.
Thanks, Graham. Claire's asked, have you had much success in getting residential use back into town or city centres above shops?
Absolutely. If I start with Newcastle, which was not only the biggest in terms of scale, but the mindset, one of the things which I'm trying to stress through this presentation is that whatever you do with the number crunching or the conservation arguments, ultimately it's mindset that you need to change, because if people don't want to do something, and that comes back to what we've just been discussing about Weymouth, if you can't change mindsets, you just can't do anything. But Newcastle went from a nominal city centre residential population over the 6 years that we ran the programme to quite a take up by housing associations, first of all. And what that demonstrated is that markets don't like to be isolated. They like to be in a crowd, the herd instinct. And once the housing association started acquiring a lot of floor space for social housing, that then triggered the private sector to develop perhaps the more complicated but the more attractive properties. And by the end of the 6 years, we saw the first apartment selling for over £1 million. So in 6 years, it went from no one considering that it was the right thing to do into having a diverse social and private market. Other places, York was more difficult because there is this prejudice between, even among property surveyors, some, that the commercial is one sector and residential is completely different. And the problem of trying to combine the two sectors in one building also provokes fears about fire separation, valuations, frustration by residents being troubled by noise from below or the other way around. But it does work, and Carlisle, I think, is probably an easier nut to crack. I wouldn't say easy, but it's more doable.
Thanks, Graham. You showed a picture of Debenhams earlier with the large car park outside of it. What's the feeling in Carlisle about not demolishing and keeping all that carbon locked up rather than demolishing and building something new? Are there many conversations that happen there about that sort of thing?
Debenhams is the what in retail terms would be described as the anchor tenant of the lanes development. So I showed the grade area with the sort of fine grain, but at the top was Debenhams, which is the magnet that attracts. There are 70 units, around about 70 units altogether in the lanes. I think because Debenhams is part of that entity, I would say it's unlikely that it will be demolished. And bear in mind, it was only built in the 80s. Then there's probably still a lot of finance locked up in the scheme. And the fact that it incorporates some parking, I think one of the challenges for Carlisle is that there are a number of plots within the walled town where people have become accustomed to bringing their car in and parking, either office developments or public surface car parks where buildings are being demolished and it's left a cleared site. And car parking is or can be a phenomenal generator of income. It's an incredible disincentive to give that up and have a site developed. And I'm sure with Debenhams there that for the moment, as long as it's generating income, there isn't the urgency to really tackle the fundamental.
That's interesting about the car parking. I didn't realise it was, it made quite so much money. On a similar topic, Claire also has said, have you had any conversations with government about 20% VAT on retrofit?
It's been part of this sector's discussion as long as this sector and 20% has existed. All I can say is that we keep having the discussions. I suspect that the people whose ears our voice is channeled to have become rather numb to the relentless persistence that we try to offer. I can't see it changing in the near future.
Yeah, it's sad. We've got 2 minutes left. Has anybody else got a question for Graham? I've got one more, but I would rather the delegates here ask one. No, I'll ask mine then. So you mentioned about breaking down conservation and regeneration areas into neighbourhoods in Carlisle, which is really interesting. And I just wondered if you've seen that done anywhere else in the UK or further afield.
One of the reasons for doing the talk the way I have is that I don't think people correlate neighbourhood as a conservation entity with the economics and the dynamics of the way people live, and particularly within city centres. So we tend to think of it, we tend to think of towns and cities as a donut. We have a sense of ownership in the inner suburbs where people act as grouped communities. But somehow city centres are the no man's land. It's everyone's and it's no one's. If it's a problem, it's someone else's problem, usually the council. So there isn't that sense, because there isn't a residential body, it tends to be, such as with the town deal, as being the agencies that come together. One of the things that I would really hope as we move into the conservation area management stage is that there can be something like a town forum that is cross-sector. When we've run conservation area grant programs previously, we've almost always had such a cross-sector panel to consider the grants and to look at management of public realm buildings, services, public transport, and so on. That doesn't really exist in Carlisle, and I think it would be good if it did. Now, whether that broke down even further into neighbourhood groups, I mean, that's beyond my remit, but I think that would be worth exploring.
Yeah, it does sound like it, doesn't it? Well, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Graham, for your time and your insight. And I know you've been a long-standing member of the network, and we really appreciate having your knowledge within the network. If anyone has any other questions for Graham that you might think of later, do drop me an email. You've probably got my email address, or you'll have had something from Eventbrite from me. I will be sending out a little survey for you to give us your feedback, because this is part of a programme of high street regeneration events, and we want to improve them all the time and make sure, you know, that we're giving you exactly what you need. So please do fill it in. It takes 1 or 2 minutes, that's all. And in the meantime, before our next events, do keep an eye on the website, because we're constantly adding new ones. Sign up for our newsletter, become a member, and just keep engaged with us. We've got lots of fingers in lots of different pies that I'm sure will interest you. So thank you all for attending this afternoon, and thanks again, Graham, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.